now entering the June archive. The corridors are still open. The terminals are still glowing. The archive remains open. Somewhere tonight, cargo ships are still crossing the Pacific, carrying oil, machinery, grain, and industrial equipment between continents. Inside quiet office buildings, settlement systems are still processing transactions long after midnight. The machinery underneath global trade never really stops moving. Most people just never see it. But there is a question appearing more often now inside central banks, trade ministries, shipping firms, and financial institutions. What happens if access to the system becomes uncertain? Not collapsed. Not gone overnight. Just less predictable than it used to feel. For a long time, most countries assumed the main financial corridors of the world would remain permanently open, stable enough for trade, reliable enough that most countries stopped worrying about the infrastructure very much. At least back then. The system just kept working. And for decades, that assumption mostly worked. The markets cleared. The cargo moved. Payments settled quietly in the background while most of the world slept. Eventually, the infrastructure underneath the system became so familiar that many people stopped thinking about it at all. It simply became part of the environment, like electricity, or shipping lanes, or the internet. Most people experience finance through surfaces. Markets opening in the morning. Currencies shifting across glowing screens late at night. Headlines moving faster than most people can follow them. But deeper inside the system, other things continue operating quietly through the night. Liquidity moving between institutions before dawn. Shipping insurance updated before cargo reaches port. Settlement schedules recalculated while cities sleep. Reserve systems balancing exposure across multiple time zones before morning. Most of the time, these systems are quiet enough that nobody notices them. Until something changes. Somewhere in Singapore tonight, there are probably still people beneath fluorescent office lights reviewing shipping manifests and settlement schedules before morning. Coffee cups beside keyboards. Rain against harbor glass. Container data moving across screens. Nothing dramatic. Just the ordinary maintenance of globalization. After enough years, people stopped thinking about the system itself. It just felt normal. Because globalization was never built only on technology or trade agreements. It was also built on confidence. Confidence that transactions would clear, that liquidity would remain available, that the financial corridors underneath global trade would still function tomorrow morning the same way they functioned yesterday. The dollar system expanded because, for a long time, participation inside the system made practical sense. Trade was expanding too quickly for older systems. The dollar system was able to move enormous amounts of money and energy through the same corridors without freezing up. Payments cleared. Energy moved. Most countries stayed inside the system because it worked. And over time, more and more of the world connected itself to the same architecture because the system was efficient enough that almost nobody wanted to operate outside it. A manufacturer in Asia could purchase machinery from Europe. An energy importer could settle oil shipments from the Gulf. Shipping companies could finance cargo moving across multiple oceans. Most people inside the system were not thinking very much about geopolitics while doing these things. They were thinking about timing, cost, risk, whether payments would still clear by morning. And because the infrastructure kept functioning, confidence in the system kept growing. The corridors stayed open long enough that many countries started treating the architecture underneath global finance almost like a permanent feature of the world itself. But systems start feeling different once too much of the world depends on them at the same time. Over the past several years, the conversations around the system have started sounding slightly different. Not loudly, not publicly. Most of the time. The cargo ships are still moving tonight. The terminals are still glowing. Transactions are still clearing through the same networks used for decades. From the outside, everything still looks stable, at least for now. Rainwater collecting on steel containers. Forklifts moving through harbour fog. Fluorescent lights still on in buildings where nobody has gone home yet. But underneath the surface, people are thinking differently about dependency now. What happens if reserve access becomes political during periods of tension? What happens if financial infrastructure stops feeling completely neutral? What happens if too much of global trade depends on systems controlled somewhere else? Those questions do not immediately break a system, but they do begin changing behavior inside it. Reserve strategies slowly diversify. Alternative settlement systems appear quietly beside older ones. Regional agreements expand. Backup corridors begin forming underneath primary corridors. The old system is still there. But countries don't seem quite as comfortable depending on only one corridor anymore. Most structural shifts don't really announce themselves. At least not at first. At the time, they usually just look like small administrative decisions made quietly inside office buildings late at night. A reserve adjustment here. A new settlement agreement there. An energy contract routed differently than it would have been 20 years ago. Individually, none of these things look large enough to reshape the global system. But over time, they accumulate. And eventually, the map underneath the world economy begins changing shape. The rain outside sounds softer now. Somewhere beyond the harbor fog, ships are still carrying the physical structure of the modern world across dark water exactly as they did yesterday. Oil, copper, machinery, food, industrial components. The visible system still looks connected. But the confidence underneath it doesn't feel quite as absolute as it used to. Most people probably won't notice the shift while it's happening. at least not at first. After the Second World War, much of the industrial world was damaged, indebted, or physically broken apart. Railways across Europe had collapsed. Ports were destroyed. Entire cities still looked unfinished, years after the fighting ended. Trade needed to restart quickly. Energy needed to move again. Governments needed something stable enough to rebuild around. And for a while, the United States was one of the only countries capable of providing that stability at scale. Its industrial base remained largely intact. Its financial system was deep. It held enormous gold reserves. And perhaps most importantly, the United States had liquidity. Money moved through the system easily. Trade financing was available. Energy shipments could settle reliably. Most people never think about liquidity very much until it disappears. Trade financing dries up surprisingly fast when money stops moving smoothly through the system. Shipping companies need financing before cargo reaches ports. Banks move money between each other, constantly overnight, just to keep ordinary economic activity functioning by morning. Most people never see any of this happening. Without liquidity, trade slows down very quickly. The post-war dollar system solved that problem better than anything else available at the time. That is why the system expanded. Not because every country agreed politically. Not because every government admired the United States. Night after night, shipping firms, banks, insurers, and energy traders kept choosing the same corridors because those corridors continued clearing trade reliably. Payments arrived on time. Liquidity remained available. Cargo financing stayed predictable enough for global movement to expand around it year after year. And underneath the visible layers of global trade sat the deepest collateral market in the world. US Treasuries. For decades, that market became the financial foundation beneath global movement itself. Imagine a shipping office in Singapore sometime during the 1970s. Fluorescent lights still on long after midnight. Stacks of paper manifests sitting beside ashtrays and coffee cups. telex machines printing settlement messages from London, New York, Tokyo. Outside the windows, tankers sit quietly in Black Harbor water, waiting for fuel transfers before continuing toward the Pacific. The people inside those offices probably were not thinking about geopolitics very much. They were thinking about efficiency, predictability, whether payments would clear on time, whether financing would still be available in the morning. Nobody inside those offices was trying to redesign the world economy. They were just choosing the system that made trade easier. One practical decision after another. A shipping company chooses the cheapest financing route. A government increases dollar reserves because commodity imports are already priced in dollars. A bank expands access to dollar funding markets because its clients need easier settlement infrastructure. And over time, the entire world begins connecting itself to the same network. Eventually, the system becomes so large that people stop noticing it altogether. It simply becomes the environment. Most people do not think about electrical grids when they turn on lights. Most people do not think about undersea communication cables when they send messages across continents. And eventually, most people stopped thinking about the dollar system itself. It became the background architecture of globalization. Stable enough that almost nobody questioned it. For decades, the arrangement benefited a large part of the world. Trade expanded. Manufacturing grew. Container shipping transformed global supply chains. Capital moved across borders at speeds previous generations could barely imagine. A manufacturer in South Korea could order machinery from Germany. An energy importer in India could settle oil shipments from the Gulf. A shipping company in Singapore could finance cargo moving through 3 continents. All because the corridor underneath global trade remained open. And after enough years, the system simply became normal. Most countries stopped thinking very much about the infrastructure itself. The corridor stayed open. Trade kept moving. After enough years, operating outside the system simply became inconvenient for most countries. After enough years, countries stopped thinking about the system as infrastructure. It just felt permanent. The interesting thing about infrastructure is that people only notice it when it becomes uncertain. You rarely think about electricity until the lights flicker. You rarely think about water systems until something stops flowing. Financial infrastructure works the same way. For a long time, the global dollar network felt neutral to most participants. Predictable, accessible, open. Then gradually, countries started realizing the infrastructure was not quite as neutral as it once appeared. A reserve account could be frozen. A payment route could become restricted. Access to liquidity could become political under certain conditions. And once countries begin noticing the existence of switches inside a system, behavior changes. At first, the changes were small, easy to ignore. Because no major civilization wants to remain fully dependent on infrastructure it does not ultimately control. That does not mean the system suddenly collapses. Most systems do not disappear dramatically. Usually they become more layered over time. Alternative routes begin forming underneath the existing architecture. Backup settlement systems appear. Regional agreements slowly expand. Central banks start diversifying reserves. Not necessarily because the old corridor has failed, but because participants no longer feel comfortable relying on only one corridor forever. That is the stage the global financial system appears to be entering now. The corridors still function. Trade still moves. The terminals still glow through the night. Rain against harbor glass. Forklifts still moving through wet container yards. Office lights still on above the ports. But the psychology underneath the system has started changing. Somewhere tonight, cargo ships are still crossing black water, carrying oil machinery, grain, lithium, copper, industrial components. The physical structure of modern civilization itself. Most of those shipments will still pass through the same financial architecture they used yesterday. But increasingly, countries are asking a different question than they asked 30 years ago. Not how do we join the system, but what happens if access to the system becomes uncertain? "30 years ago, most countries were asking how to enter the system. Now, more of them seem to be asking how dependent they want to become. The conversations sound different now. For a long time, most countries stopped thinking about the financial system very much. The corridors stayed open, payments cleared, trade kept moving. After enough years, the infrastructure simply started feeling permanent, stable, continuous, available the moment you needed it. Banks trusted the system enough to move enormous amounts of money through the same corridors every day. The system worked long enough that more and more of the world started depending on it without really thinking about dependency itself. Then gradually, the conversations started changing. Not with collapse, not with panic. Usually just with uncertainty. A reserve account is frozen. A payment route becomes politically sensitive. A sanctions package expands further than expected. And suddenly the infrastructure feels different than it used to. Because there is a major difference between using a system and depending completely on a system you do not control. For years, many governments accepted that trade-offs existed inside the architecture. That was simply part of the system. But over time, especially after repeated episodes involving sanctions, reserve restrictions, and payment controls, more countries started asking practical questions. What happens if access to dollar liquidity becomes difficult during a crisis? What happens if geopolitical tensions interfere with settlement infrastructure? What happens if reserve assets held abroad become politically vulnerable? These discussions usually sound technical from the outside. Reserve exposure, settlement access, liquidity risk. But underneath them sits a much larger question. How dependent is too dependent? Imagine a central bank office late at night. Fluorescent lights still on above long conference tables. Reserve reports spread across the room. Shipping data updating quietly across computer screens. Coffee that has already gone cold. Nobody inside the room believes they are redesigning the global financial system. They are just trying to reduce exposure before the next crisis arrives. One reserve adjustment at a time. One settlement agreement at a time. From the outside, the infrastructure still looks stable. Dollar funding markets are still functioning. Oil continues moving across oceans. Cargo still arrives before dawn in ports spread across multiple continents. But underneath the visible machinery, the thinking around the system has started changing. The language around the system sounds different now. Backup systems, alternative payment rails, regional settlement infrastructure, reserve diversification, bilateral trade agreements settled outside traditional corridors. The old system is still there, but countries do not seem quite as comfortable depending entirely on one corridor anymore. That does not necessarily mean the existing system disappears. Large systems rarely vanish quickly. Usually they become layered. Additional corridors slowly emerge beneath the original one. Trade starts routing through multiple channels instead of only one. Central banks diversify reserve composition gradually over time. Energy exporters experiment with different settlement structures. Not because the old network suddenly stopped functioning, but because governments no longer want absolute dependency on any single corridor. The dollar system is still dominant, at least for now. But the psychology surrounding the system has changed noticeably compared to 20 or 30 years ago. "30 years ago, most conversations were about joining the global system. Now, more conversations seem to revolve around exposure, dependency, what happens during periods of tension? How much dependency is too much dependency? How much reserve infrastructure should exist outside another country's legal or political reach? "30 years ago, these conversations were happening at the edges of the system. Now they seem much closer to the center. And once countries begin designing alternatives, even at small scale, the structure of the system slowly changes. A local currency agreement here. A regional payment system there. An increase in gold reserves. A commodity transaction settled outside the usual corridor. A reserve adjustment there. A commodity shipment settled differently than it would have been 20 years ago. Small changes. Easy to ignore at first. Repeated over enough years, until eventually the system no longer feels quite the same. The rain outside sounds steady tonight. Cargo aircraft are probably still crossing the Pacific right now, carrying electronics, industrial equipment, pharmaceuticals, machine parts. Container ships are still moving through the Strait of Malacca. Tankers are still drifting through dark water toward refineries that will need settlement by morning. The physical machinery of globalization is still operating. But the financial psychology beneath it has started shifting. From the outside, the machinery still looks stable. The ships are still moving. The terminals are still glowing. But the conversations underneath the system sound different now. Large structural changes rarely announce themselves clearly. Usually they begin quietly. Most people never see these changes happening directly. They happen inside shipping contracts, reserve reports, quiet negotiations between institutions most people will never hear about. If you want to understand where the global system is moving, it helps to stop focusing only on headlines. Watch the flows instead. Watch the ships. Watch where energy moves. Watch how reserves start shifting over time. Because increasingly, some of those flows are beginning to move differently than they used to. Not dramatically, gradually. Imagine looking at the world from above late at night. Cargo ships crossing black water between continents. Container ports still operating under floodlights long after midnight. Aircraft carrying industrial equipment through darkness towards cities most people will never visit. From the outside, the machinery still looks stable. But beneath that machinery, parts of the financial architecture have started quietly rerouting. Some energy trades are now settled outside traditional dollar channels. Regional payment systems have expanded. Certain countries are conducting more bilateral trade directly in local currencies than they did a decade ago. Alternative clearing infrastructure has grown slowly in parallel with older systems. None of this means the existing network disappears tomorrow morning. The dollar system is still dominant. That has not changed. For a long time, much of the world moved through the same financial corridors. But dependence starts feeling different once governments begin imagining what happens if access becomes uncertain. And once countries begin thinking seriously about exposure, they usually start looking for alternatives. Not replacements. Alternatives. Because most governments are not trying to destroy the existing system. They are trying to reduce the risk of depending entirely on a single corridor. The language sounds different now. Resilience, redundancy, diversification, backup systems. More countries seem to want backup options now. The ability to keep trade moving even if one corridor becomes politically unstable or operationally difficult. History has taught governments something uncomfortable. Corridors change eventually. Trade routes shift. Reserve structures evolve. Power centers move. Dependence feels stable until conditions change. That awareness sits quietly underneath a lot of decision-making now. Quietly, without dramatic speeches, without headlines announcing that a new era has officially begun. Most structural transitions do not look historic while they are happening. At the time, they usually look administrative. A reserve adjustment here. A new payment agreement there. An increase in gold purchases by central banks. A bilateral energy deal settled differently than it would have been 20 years ago. Individually, these decisions appear small. Gold has quietly returned to the conversation again. Not because governments suddenly want to abandon modern finance, and not because the world is becoming less digital. If anything, the world is becoming more digital every year. But during periods of uncertainty, countries usually start thinking differently about reserves that exist outside another government's direct control. Somewhere tonight, physical bullion is still moving through rain-covered runways beneath armed security. Vault inventories are still being audited. Reserve reports are still being updated long after midnight. Meanwhile, the world above those reserves continues becoming more digital every year. Digital systems continue expanding. But underneath them, governments still seem unwilling to rely entirely on promises alone. governments seem less certain about the future than they were 20 or 30 years ago. That does not necessarily mean fragmentation is inevitable. But governments do seem less certain that the world will remain as open as it once felt. The rain outside sounds heavier now. Somewhere beyond the harbor tonight, oil tankers are still moving through black water toward refineries that will require settlement by morning. Container ships continue carrying the industrial structure of modern civilization through narrow maritime corridors. The visible world still looks connected. But more countries seem interested in building secondary routes now. Quietly. One agreement at a time. For years, people kept predicting some kind of dramatic financial break, a collapse, a replacement. One system disappearing while another suddenly takes its place. But large systems rarely move that cleanly. Older corridors continue operating while new ones slowly begin forming beside them. The result is not always collapse. Sometimes it is separation. Collapse is visible, immediate, easy to recognize. Separation is slower. The machinery continues operating while the assumptions underneath it gradually begin changing. Markets still open in the morning. Currencies still trade through the night. From the surface, the system still appears deeply connected. But underneath that familiarity, the assumptions supporting globalization no longer feel quite as singular as they once did. For a long time, the world moved as though globalization would continue expanding indefinitely. More integration, more interdependence, more countries connected through the same financial infrastructure. And for decades, the system appeared stable enough that most people stopped questioning the direction entirely. But interconnected systems start feeling different once trust between major participants weakens. especially once governments begin imagining scenarios where access to infrastructure no longer feels completely guaranteed. More governments seem less certain that trust will remain automatic forever. Not all at once. Quietly, reserve strategies shift. Trade agreements evolve. Alternative payment systems expand gradually beside older ones. Energy settlement patterns begin moving through additional corridors. Most countries are not trying to abandon the existing system completely. But more of them seem interested in reducing total dependency on any single corridor. The next world may feel more layered than the last one did. Regional systems, different reserve strategies, multiple payment corridors operating at the same time. Some countries remaining deeply connected to traditional dollar infrastructure. Others building partial alternatives beside it. Most operating somewhere in between. But historically, civilizations often behave this way during uncertain periods. They diversify. They hedge. They build redundancy. And once redundancy becomes part of strategic planning, the structure underneath the system slowly changes. Secondary corridors emerge. Alternative settlement routes expand. Reserve exposure becomes more distributed across different assets and jurisdictions. Not evenly, not cleanly, but noticeably. Over time, trust itself starts becoming more conditional, more regional, more connected to political alignment, strategic relationships, and infrastructure access than many people assumed possible 20 years ago. Most people rarely think about trust directly until it weakens. For decades, large parts of the world treated the financial system almost like permanent infrastructure. Something that would simply always be there. Now, more countries seem to be treating it differently. not as the only possible system, but as one important system among several. Reserve decisions change. Trade routes adapt. Energy settlement patterns evolve. Financial relationships become more flexible. And gradually, the system starts feeling less singular than it used to. None of this guarantees instability. In some ways, redundancy can increase resilience. Civilizations often build backup systems because they are trying to avoid catastrophic disruption. But once parallel infrastructure exists at meaningful scale, power itself becomes more distributed than it used to be. Somewhere tonight, financial centers across the world are still glowing through the dark. Servers continue processing transactions. Ships continue crossing oceans. Central banks continue reviewing reserve exposure beneath fluorescent office lights long after midnight. Trade officials continue negotiating agreements most citizens will never read. The visible machinery of globalization is still functioning. But underneath it, governments increasingly seem to be preparing for a world that feels less predictable than the one globalization originally promised. For decades, one of the central questions was usually, how deeply should countries integrate into the existing system? Now the conversations sound different. How much dependency is too much dependency? How much infrastructure should exist outside another country's political reach? The rain outside has almost faded now. The harbor sounds feel distant. Somewhere beyond the darkness, container ships are still carrying the physical structure of the modern world across oceans exactly as they did yesterday. The world still looks connected. Yet the assumptions underneath that connection no longer feel quite as permanent as they once did. The world outside your window probably still looks almost the same as it did yesterday. The roads still carry traffic. Office towers are still glowing late into the night. Cargo ships are still crossing oceans beneath radar, fog, and heavy weather somewhere beyond the harbor. And right now, long after midnight, settlement systems are still processing transactions quietly inside buildings most people will never enter. From the surface, the machinery of globalization still feels stable, familiar, continuous. But large systems often begin changing underneath long before the changes become visible above ground. Usually the transition starts quietly. A reserve adjustment here, a new payment corridor there. An energy contract settled differently than it would have been 20 years ago. Small changes, repeated over enough years until eventually the architecture underneath the world no longer feels quite the same. For decades, the global financial system connected enormous parts of the planet through a shared corridor of liquidity, trade, and settlement. And for a long time, most countries assumed that corridor would remain permanently open. Reliable enough for energy markets, stable enough for trade, deep enough for the modern world to continue expanding through it indefinitely. But the conversations surrounding the system sound different now. Less certain, more cautious, more focused on resilience than permanence. Not because global trade is disappearing, and not because the existing system suddenly stopped functioning, but more governments seem less comfortable depending entirely on a single corridor now. And once countries begin building redundancy into a system, the structure underneath it slowly starts changing. Not all at once. Quietly. Somewhere tonight, central banks are still reviewing reserve exposure beneath fluorescent office lights. Trade officials are still negotiating agreements most citizens will never read. Energy shipments are still moving through narrow maritime corridors beneath heavy rain and black water. And inside quiet buildings filled with humming servers and half-empty coffee cups, people are still redesigning small pieces of the infrastructure holding the global economy together. Most of those decisions will never appear on television. Most people will never notice them while they are happening. But systems are often reshaped long before the public realizes the shape has changed. More governments now seem less interested in assuming the future will look exactly like the past. And once enough countries begin building redundancy into a system, the structure underneath it slowly begins changing with them. Because civilizations behave differently once trust stops feeling completely automatic. In the next audit, we move deeper into the infrastructure itself. The energy corridors, the reserve flows, the logistics networks operating quietly beneath the visible economy every night while most of the world sleeps. Because money rarely moves alone. It moves with shipping routes, with commodities, with energy, with physical systems most people never think about until something interrupts them. For now, the corridors are still open, and the rain continues falling somewhere beyond the harbor. The archive remains open. Somewhere tonight, thousands of ships are still moving across dark water beneath satellite tracking systems most people will never think about. Oil tankers crossing the Arabian Sea, container ships moving through the Strait of Malacca, bulk carriers drifting slowly toward industrial ports long after midnight while rain moves across empty container yards. From above, the world almost looks quiet. But underneath the darkness, the machinery never really stops moving. Energy, food, machinery, copper, liquefied natural gas, industrial components. The physical structure of modern civilization itself. Most people experience globalization through screens, prices, charts, headlines. But globalization is also physical. Steel, fuel, ports, pipelines, shipping corridors. Infrastructure stretching across oceans quietly enough that most people rarely think about it, until something interrupts the flow. Take a breath. And imagine standing above the planet very late at night. Thousands of tiny moving lights crossing black oceans beneath cloud cover. Cargo aircraft carrying industrial equipment between continents. Refineries glowing orange against coastal fog. Harbour cranes still operating beneath floodlights while office towers slowly go dark above the ports. The modern world never fully sleeps. It reroutes. And increasingly, more governments seem interested in what happens if too much of the world depends on the same routes at the same time. For decades, much of the global economy moved through a relatively concentrated set of corridors. Certain ports became indispensable. Certain shipping lanes became foundational. Certain currencies became deeply embedded inside energy settlement itself. And after enough years, the system underneath global trade simply started feeling permanent. Stable enough that most people stopped thinking about the infrastructure very much. Physical systems feel different once stability starts feeling less certain. Because every financial system eventually reconnects back to logistics, to fuel, to delivery, to movement. Money settles contracts. But ships still have to arrive. Somewhere tonight, there are probably still shipping analysts beneath fluorescent office lights reviewing maritime traffic patterns before morning. Coffee beside keyboards. Rain against harbour glass. Satellite maps glowing quietly across darkened rooms. Most people inside those buildings are not trying to redesign the world economy. They are just trying to keep things moving before morning. One rerouted shipment at a time. And over the past several years, the conversations around infrastructure have started sounding different. Resilience, redundancy, supply chain security, alternative corridors, backup routes. Not because the old systems vanished, but dependence starts feeling different once too much of the world relies on the same corridors at the same time. Most structural changes begin quietly. A shipping route expands here. A new port agreement there. Pipeline capacity increases somewhere beyond the desert. Rail corridors stretching deeper across regions that once depended entirely on maritime routes. Individually, most of these developments look administrative, technical, easy to ignore. But over enough years, the map underneath the global economy begins changing shape. The rain outside sounds heavier now. Somewhere farther inland tonight, freight trains are still carrying industrial cargo through rain-soaked rail corridors toward distribution hubs that will restart before dawn. Electrical balancing systems are still shifting pressure quietly across regional grids, while refinery maintenance crews continue working beneath floodlights, somewhere beyond the coastline. After midnight, the modern world starts looking more physical. During the day, globalization feels abstract. Charts, headlines, currencies moving across glowing screens. People talking about markets while the machinery underneath them keeps moving quietly in the background. But late at night, the structure becomes easier to see, because underneath finance, there are still ships moving through dark water. Somewhere tonight, enormous oil tankers are still crossing narrow maritime corridors, carrying enough fuel to keep entire cities alive by morning. Liquefied natural gas drifting toward coastal terminals beneath heavy fog. Refineries glowing orange against black shorelines while rain moves slowly across steel pipelines. Cargo aircraft carrying industrial components through darkness toward manufacturing zones that will restart before sunrise. Most people never see any of this directly. The lights turn on. The trains keep moving. The elevators still work. And eventually, the infrastructure underneath daily life becomes almost invisible. Take a breath. And imagine how much coordination is required just to keep one major city functioning continuously. Fuel deliveries arriving on schedule. Shipping containers unloaded before dawn. Electrical grids balancing pressure through the night. backup reserves waiting quietly beneath industrial districts. Ports operating beneath floodlights while office towers above them slowly empty. Most people only notice the system once something fails to arrive. For decades, much of the global economy depended on a relatively concentrated set of energy corridors. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal. Narrow passages carrying enormous portions of global trade through dark water every night, while most of the world sleeps. And after enough years, the corridors themselves started feeling permanent, reliable, automatic, as though the movement would never really stop. But systems feel different once stability becomes less certain. Suddenly, distance matters more. Storage capacity matters more. Backup routes matter more. A delayed tanker matters more. A shipping disruption matters more. Suddenly, people start paying attention to things they stopped thinking about years ago. Somewhere tonight, there are probably still people beneath fluorescent office lights, reviewing tanker positions before morning. Radar screens glowing blue across darkened rooms. Coffee cooling beside shipping schedules. Weather systems moving slowly across maritime maps. Container delays updating quietly inside logistics software. Most people inside those buildings are not thinking about history. They are just trying to keep things moving before sunrise. One shipment at a time. And over the past several years, the conversations surrounding infrastructure have started sounding slightly different. Resilience, redundancy, storage capacity, alternative corridors, backup supply chains. Not because the old system disappeared. The ships are still moving tonight. The terminals are still glowing. But dependence starts feeling different once enough disruptions begin stacking on top of each other. Pandemics, shipping delays, insurance complications, regional instability, sanctions, port congestion. One disruption becomes another, then another. The system still works, but people seem less certain it will always work the same way. For a long time, globalization moved toward concentration. Cheaper routes, faster delivery, larger ports, more centralized logistics. And for decades, the system functioned efficiently enough that very few people questioned the direction. A system optimized for speed can start feeling fragile once interruptions happen too often. Somewhere beyond the harbor tonight, tankers are still drifting through black water, carrying enough energy to power industrial regions before morning. Pipelines are still humming beneath rain-soaked ground. Ports are still unloading fuel beneath floodlights and ocean fog. The machinery is still operating, but more countries seem less comfortable depending entirely on a single route now, especially for systems this important. Shipping routes slowly change political behavior. Pipeline access changes negotiations. Port construction changes trade patterns. Money still follows movement. Fuel still has to arrive. And once governments begin thinking more seriously about resilience, the map underneath global energy movement slowly starts changing shape. Additional pipeline systems appear. Strategic reserves expand. Rail infrastructure deepens across regions once dependent almost entirely on maritime shipping. Energy settlement systems begin attaching themselves to newer trade corridors. Not dramatically, quietly. Small administrative decisions repeated over enough years until eventually the system underneath the world starts feeling different. The rain outside sounds heavier now. Somewhere beyond the darkness tonight, tankers are still crossing black water beneath blinking navigation lights, while coastal refineries wait for deliveries before dawn. The routes carrying energy across the world are slowly becoming less singular than they once were. For a long time, the modern world treated uninterrupted movement almost like a permanent condition. Cargo would arrive, fuel would move, the corridors would remain open. And after enough years, most people stopped thinking very much about how narrow some of those corridors actually were. The Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca. Narrow passages carrying enormous amounts of global trade through dark water every night, while most of the world sleeps. Most people rarely think about these places directly. At certain points, enormous portions of the global economy pass through waterways narrow enough to see the opposite shoreline through fog. Tankers, container vessels, fuel, industrial cargo, all compressed into corridors that can slow down far more easily than most people realize. And imagine what happens once too much movement depends on too few pathways. Across the system tonight, there are probably cargo vessels sitting offshore waiting for clearance beneath heavy rain and blinking navigation lights. Engines idling quietly in dark water. Containers stacked motionless above wet steel decks. Delays spreading outward through systems most people will never see directly. Shipping schedules begin shifting quietly behind the scenes. Insurance costs start adjusting before most cargo even reaches port. Somewhere farther down the chain, fuel deliveries arrive slightly later than expected. Routes lengthen. Insurance costs rise. Ports become congested. Refrigerated storage systems still humming inside distribution facilities, waiting for delayed inventory before sunrise. Forklifts parked beneath fluorescent warehouse lighting, while routing software continues recalculating delivery schedules through the night. Most people never see these delays directly. They only notice the effects several weeks later. slightly higher prices. Longer delivery times. Empty inventory space where something was expected to be. Screens start flashing long before most people understand what actually slowed down. Across the system tonight, maritime analysts are probably still monitoring vessel traffic beneath fluorescent office lights, while weather systems move slowly across digital shipping maps. Container delays updating quietly across darkened screens. Port congestion reports arriving before dawn. Radar systems tracking movement through heavy weather and narrow maritime lanes. Most people inside those rooms are just trying to keep movement stable before morning. Rain against harbor glass. Coffee going cold beside shipping schedules. For decades, many governments assumed the primary corridors of globalization would remain permanently open, regardless of political tension. Stable enough for energy markets. Reliable enough that most shipping schedules simply kept moving. For a long time, the system mostly worked. The cargo arrived often enough that most people stopped thinking about how fragile uninterrupted movement actually is. Modern life simply continued functioning around the assumption that the corridors would remain open. Late tonight, there are still ports operating beneath heavy weather exactly the way they did 10 years ago. Cranes lifting containers above black water. Fuel transfers continuing beneath floodlights. Schedules updating quietly across terminal screens, while rain moves across the harbor outside. From the surface, the machinery still looks stable, familiar, even. Until something slows down. But assumptions feel different once disruptions start happening more often. Pandemics, shipping delays, insurance complications, regional instability, port congestion, sanctions. One disruption becomes another, then another. Ships wait offshore longer than expected. Warehouses begin adjusting delivery schedules before sunrise. Insurance calls continue late into the night. Somewhere farther down the chain, manufacturing timelines quietly begin moving backward by a few days at a time. Most people never notice the disruption at the moment it happens. They notice it later, gradually. Once stability feels less certain, backup systems start appearing almost automatically. Additional ports receive investment. Storage capacity expands. Shipping firms increase contingency planning. Alternative insurance arrangements begin forming beside older ones. Rail infrastructure deepens across regions previously considered secondary. Not dramatically, quietly. Small adjustments repeated quietly over time, until eventually the system underneath global trade starts feeling different. The digital world feels almost weightless sometimes. Instant, abstract. Yet somewhere beneath that digital layer, physical movement continues through storms, narrow waterways, and crowded ports every hour of the night. Steel moving through rain, fuel moving beneath oceans. But physical systems still depend on geography. Storm systems interrupt movement. Narrow waterways create bottlenecks. Fog slows visibility across crowded shipping lanes. Steel still has to physically arrive somewhere before the system above it can continue functioning normally. Cranes still unload containers before dawn while cities sleep above the harbor. Human coordination continuing through the night while most of the population sleeps. In logistics centers, cargo vessels are still waiting offshore beneath blinking navigation lights. Tankers are still drifting through narrow maritime corridors, carrying energy toward industrial regions that cannot afford interruption. And inside logistics centers around the world, people are still quietly rerouting shipments before morning. Not because the existing system vanished. The ships are still moving tonight. But the system feels narrower once you finally see how much depends on so few routes. Navigation lights drifting slowly against black water. Rain moving across silent container stacks. Somewhere beyond the fog tonight, there are still anchored ships drifting silently beneath blinking navigation lights, waiting for clearance before dawn. The machinery never fully stops. It slows, it reroutes, it waits. More governments seem less willing to depend entirely on a single pathway now. Especially once vulnerability becomes visible. For a long time, most people assumed there was only one real map underneath globalization. One primary set of routes. One dominant financial language. One enormous system connecting fuel, shipping, liquidity, manufacturing, and trade across much of the planet simultaneously. And after enough decades, the architecture underneath that system started feeling almost permanent. Not because people studied it closely, because it kept functioning. The cargo arrived. Fuel continued moving. Containers crossed oceans. Settlement systems stayed online through the night. And eventually, the infrastructure underneath global trade became so familiar that most people stopped thinking about it directly. Like electrical grids, or undersea cables, or shipping lanes disappearing into fog beyond the harbor. But large systems often begin changing quietly, underneath long before the surface appears different. Across industrial corridors, there are probably still conference rooms lit long after midnight, where trade officials are reviewing shipping access agreements most citizens will never hear about. Coffee cups beside half-open reserve reports. Rain moving slowly across dark glass outside financial districts. Satellite maps glowing softly against walls, while cargo projections continue updating through the night. Most of these conversations never become headlines. Most people never notice them happening at all. And yet slowly, another map has started forming beneath the older one. Not replacing it, not overtaking it overnight, just expanding quietly beside it. Additional rail corridors stretching deeper across continents. Regional settlement systems growing beside older financial infrastructure. Ports expanding in locations that once seemed strategically secondary. Pipeline agreements continuing quietly beneath larger geopolitical headlines. Alternative payment arrangements attached directly to physical trade routes. At first, most of these developments looked technical, administrative, easy to ignore. The kind of things buried deep inside infrastructure reports and trade documents. Nobody outside the system ever reads carefully. But structural transitions rarely feel historic while they are happening. At the time, they usually just feel administrative. A shipping agreement adjusted here. A logistics corridor expanded there. An energy contract settled slightly differently than it would have been 15 years ago. Small adjustments repeated quietly over time until eventually the map underneath the world economy starts feeling different. Beyond the coastline, cargo is still moving through the same major corridors that dominated global trade 20 years ago. Inland logistics hubs are still routing freight across rail networks, stretching through industrial districts before dawn. Pipelines continue moving fuel beneath rain-soaked ground, while maintenance crews monitor pressure systems through the night. Container cranes are still unloading steel boxes before sunrise. Radar systems are still tracking maritime movement through heavy weather while cities sleep above the harbor. From the surface, the machinery still looks familiar. But alongside those older corridors, secondary routes have started expanding. Quietly. Additional rail infrastructure, backup energy pathways, regional clearing systems, trade agreements designed around redundancy instead of pure efficiency. Not because governments expect a primary structure to disappear tomorrow morning, but dependence starts feeling different once enough disruptions begin stacking on top of each other. Pandemics, sanctions, port congestion, insurance complications, shipping delays. regional instability. One disruption becomes another, then another. And gradually, systems built almost entirely around uninterrupted flow start adapting to a world that feels less predictable than it once did. For decades, globalization rewarded concentration, larger ports, faster delivery systems, more centralized logistics, more movement compressed into the same major corridors. Efficiency became the priority because efficiency worked. Until resilience started mattering too. Somewhere tonight, there are probably infrastructure planners reviewing long-term supply vulnerabilities beneath fluorescent office lighting while rainwater moves slowly across empty streets outside. Shipping projections spread across conference tables. Freight data glowing against half-dark rooms. Most people inside those buildings are not trying to redesign civilization. They are just trying to reduce exposure before the next disruption arrives. One corridor at a time. Take a moment and imagine looking down at the planet very late at night from somewhere high above cloud cover. Shipping lanes crossing black oceans. Clusters of industrial light surrounding coastal ports. Cargo aircraft drifting between manufacturing zones before sunrise. The old routes are still there, still crowded, still moving. But underneath those familiar pathways, another layer has started forming. Additional routes, systems forming beside older ones. More options than the world used to have. Not fully visible yet, but expanding quietly. The rain outside sounds softer now. Somewhere beyond the harbor tonight, ships are still moving through black water exactly the way they did yesterday. Navigation lights drifting slowly through fog. Container terminals glowing against the coastline before dawn. The machinery never fully stops. New routes appear beside older ones. Movement shifts quietly beneath the surface. the system adapts. More countries seem interested in keeping additional routes available now, especially for systems this essential to daily life. For a long time, people imagined the future as something that would arrive clearly. One world ending, another beginning. A visible transition everyone would recognize immediately while it was happening. But large systems rarely move that way. Usually the change is slower than people expect. Older structures continue functioning while newer structures begin forming quietly beside them. And for a while, both worlds exist at the same time. That is part of what makes structural transitions so difficult to recognize from inside them. The world outside still looks familiar. Markets still open every morning. Cargo still arrives. Fuel still moves through pipelines beneath rain-soaked ground, while ships continue crossing oceans through the night. Most people wake up expecting electricity, deliveries, transportation, internet access, functioning payment systems. And most mornings, the system still provides all of it. From the surface, the machinery still appears stable. Office towers still glow above financial districts long after midnight. Container ports still operate beneath floodlights before dawn. Settlement systems still clear transactions quietly while most of the population sleeps. Most of the system still appears remarkably intact tonight. But underneath that visible stability, the assumptions supporting the system have started sounding slightly different. For decades, globalization moved toward concentration. More integration, larger ports, faster shipping, supply chains stretching across larger distances through the same major corridors. And for a long time, the system functioned efficiently enough that very few countries seriously questioned the direction. Efficiency worked until uncertainty started becoming harder to ignore. Now the language around the system sounds different. Exposure, redundancy, resilience, strategic autonomy, supply chain security, alternative settlement infrastructure, backup corridors. Not dramatic language, not revolutionary language, administrative language. The kind of language that appears quietly inside infrastructure planning meetings and trade reports most people never read. Somewhere tonight, central banks are still reviewing reserve exposure beneath fluorescent office lighting long after midnight. Trade officials are still negotiating shipping access agreements across conference tables, scattered with freight projections and logistics schedules. Energy planners are still modeling disruptions that may never happen. Rain moving against dark financial district windows. Coffee cooling beside half-open infrastructure reports. Satellite maps glowing softly against walls inside half-lit rooms. Most people inside those buildings are not trying to redesign the world. They are trying to prepare for a wider range of outcomes than they once expected. And uncertainty changes behavior even before systems physically change. Once governments begin questioning whether uninterrupted access can always be guaranteed, they start building options. Additional reserves. Alternative payment systems. Energy pathways capable of functioning if major corridors slow down. Additional routes beside the older ones. Not necessarily because collapse is imminent. The ships are still moving tonight. The terminals are still glowing. But civilizations rarely remain fully dependent on a single pathway, once vulnerability becomes visible enough. For decades, many countries treated the dominant financial and logistical architecture almost like part of the natural environment. Permanent, stable, always available when needed, like electrical grids, or shipping lanes, or undersea communication cables disappearing into darkness beneath the ocean floor. But systems connected to power rarely feel completely permanent forever. Especially once disruptions begin happening often enough that governments start imagining scenarios they previously considered unlikely. pandemics, shipping delays, sanctions, insurance complications, regional instability, port congestion. One disruption becomes another, then another. Gradually, the system starts adapting to a world that feels less predictable than it once did. Over enough years, those adjustments begin reshaping the structure underneath the world economy. Trade routes diversify. Settlement systems multiply. Reserve strategies become more distributed. Energy infrastructure expands across additional corridors. Financial relationships become more regional. The world still looks deeply connected tonight. But underneath that connection, the architecture has started becoming more layered than it once was. Somewhere tonight, there are probably anchored cargo vessels drifting silently beyond harbor fog, waiting for clearance before dawn. Navigation lights reflecting slowly against black water. Container cranes still unloading steel boxes beneath freezing rain, while cities sleep above the coastline. Radar systems still tracking movement across crowded maritime lanes through the middle of the night. The machinery never fully stops. It slows, it reroutes, it waits. For decades, the dominant assumption was simple. The primary corridors would remain open indefinitely. Now the assumptions sound less certain. And once uncertainty settles deeply enough into the system, secondary structures begin forming almost automatically. Backup routes, backup reserves, backup systems. Not fully replacing the older architecture, just growing quietly beside it. Take a moment and imagine looking down at the planet very late at night from somewhere far above cloud cover. Shipping lanes still crossing black oceans. Ports still glowing beside dark coastlines. Aircraft still carrying industrial cargo through the atmosphere before sunrise. The old system is still there, still crowded, still moving through the night. But underneath the systems that shaped globalization for decades, governments, logistics planners, and financial institutions are already preparing for a world with more routes, more redundancy, and fewer assumptions about permanence. Most of those adjustments still look administrative for now. But over enough years, administrative changes reshape systems too. The world outside your window probably looks almost identical to yesterday. Traffic still moves through wet streets. Office towers still glow above the harbor. Cargo vessels are still crossing dark oceans tonight beneath radar systems and heavy weather most people will never see directly. And somewhere right now, long after midnight, logistics networks are still recalculating routes while cities sleep. From the surface, the machinery still appears stable. Most systems change quietly at first, long before the surface looks any different. Through shipping agreements, infrastructure investment, reserve planning, backup corridors. Small adjustments repeated quietly over time, until eventually the map underneath the world starts feeling different. For decades, globalization concentrated enormous amounts of movement through a relatively narrow set of financial and physical corridors. And for a long time, the system worked efficiently enough that many people assumed the structure would simply continue expanding forever. Now the assumptions feel less automatic. Not because the existing system vanished, but more of the world seems less comfortable depending on only one set of corridors now. Across the system tonight, there are still ports operating beneath floodlights exactly the way they did years ago. Fuel transfers continuing through heavy rain. Container cranes moving slowly against harbor fog. Coffee cooling beside half-lit logistics screens before dawn. Most people inside those rooms are just trying to keep movement stable before morning. One shipment at a time. The visible world still looks connected tonight. But underneath those familiar movements, the structure supporting global trade has started becoming more layered than it once was. Somewhere tonight, freight schedules are still being rerouted quietly across rail systems, warehouse networks, pipelines, and ports, while most cities sleep. Most people will probably not recognize how much the system has changed until much later. The archive remains open. Somewhere tonight, cargo ships are still crossing dark oceans beneath blinking navigation lights, while rain moves slowly across container terminals near the coastline. Oil still arrives before dawn. Containers are still unloaded beneath floodlights. Freight trains are still carrying industrial cargo towards cities that expect ordinary life to continue functioning by morning. From the surface, the machinery still appears connected. Movement continues. Trade continues. The ships are still moving tonight. But moving cargo is only part of the system. Because eventually, every shipment reaches the same question. Who actually settles the balance once the trade is complete? For most people, globalization feels almost automatic. You order something, it arrives. Fuel reaches the station. Electricity stays on. Transactions clear quietly through banking systems. Most people never think about directly. And after enough years, the infrastructure underneath all of it starts feeling almost permanent. Stable enough that most people stop asking how the system actually holds itself together. But movement alone is not enough to sustain a global financial system. Cargo can arrive at port. Oil can cross oceans. Factories can continue operating through the night. And still, underneath all of it, another process has to continue functioning quietly in the background. Settlement. Because eventually, every shipment becomes a payment problem. Every trade becomes an obligation. Every energy delivery becomes a question of payment, liquidity, collateral, and trust moving between institutions, separated by enormous distances. The ships move physically. Settlement moves through trust. Most people experience finance through visible surfaces. Currencies, markets, bank accounts glowing softly against phone screens late at night. But underneath those visible layers sits another world, operating continuously through the dark. Clearing systems, reserve balances, correspondent banking networks. Collateral moving quietly between institutions before sunrise. Liquidity flowing across systems most citizens will never see directly. The machinery underneath settlement never fully stops. Most people just never notice it. For decades, much of the world relied on a relatively concentrated settlement structure. Trade moved through familiar corridors. Energy contracts settled through familiar institutions. Reserve assets accumulated inside systems, trusted deeply enough that participants stopped questioning the infrastructure very much at all. And after enough time, the architecture underneath settlement itself started feeling less like a system and more like part of the natural environment. Like electrical grids, or shipping lanes, or undersea cables disappearing silently beneath the ocean floor. But systems connected to trust feel different once neutrality starts feeling less certain. Because trade is one thing, final settlement is something else entirely. A country can reroute shipping. It can diversify suppliers. It can build additional trade corridors. But settlement depends heavily on confidence. Confidence that the system will still remain accessible during periods of stress. And confidence becomes more fragile once geopolitics enters the system directly. Right now, beneath fluorescent office lighting in financial districts most people will never enter, liquidity exposure is still being reviewed before morning. Reserve balances updating quietly across darkened terminals. Cross-border payment schedules moving through systems most citizens will never see directly. Coffee cooling beside settlement reports, while rain moves slowly against financial district windows outside. Most people inside those rooms are not trying to redesign the world economy. They are trying to reduce uncertainty inside systems, too important to fail suddenly. Over the past several years, the conversations around settlement have started sounding slightly different. Alternative clearing systems, regional payment infrastructure, local currency agreements, gold settlement mechanisms, backup liquidity arrangements. Not because the old architecture disappeared. The transactions are still clearing tonight. The machinery is still functioning. But dependence starts feeling different once enough participants begin questioning whether access can always remain politically neutral. Take a moment and imagine how much trust is required just to keep one ordinary financial day functioning normally across multiple continents. Banks trusting counterparties they will never physically meet. Governments holding reserve assets inside systems controlled somewhere else. Energy exporters shipping fuel across oceans, expecting payment infrastructure to remain available tomorrow morning, exactly the way it functioned yesterday. Most of the time, the machinery continues operating quietly enough that nobody notices the trust underneath it at all. Until something interrupts the flow. The rain outside sounds softer now. Beyond the harbor, cargo is still moving across black water beneath blinking navigation lights, exactly the way it did yesterday. But underneath that movement, more countries seem increasingly interested in building settlement systems capable of functioning under a wider range of political conditions than the world once assumed possible. The visible structure of global trade still appears deeply connected. Yet inside the financial layer beneath it, the assumptions supporting settlement no longer feel quite as permanent as they once did. For a long time, much of the world treated the dominant financial system almost like infrastructure. Stable, continuous, always available when needed. Like electrical grids humming quietly beneath cities through the middle of the night. Or shipping lanes disappearing into fog beyond the harbor. or undersea communication cables resting silently beneath enormous pressure at the bottom of the ocean floor, while entire economies move through them every second without ever seeing them directly. And because the machinery continued functioning year after year, most participants stopped thinking very much about the trust required to keep it operating. Transactions cleared, liquidity remained available, reserve assets stayed accessible. Energy contracts settled quietly in the background while most of the world slept. And after enough decades, the system underneath settlement itself started feeling almost natural. Less like infrastructure designed by institutions, more like part of the environment, like weather, like gravity. Something permanent enough that most people stopped imagining what the world might look like if confidence inside the system ever became less automatic than it once felt. But settlement systems are built almost entirely on confidence. Confidence that transactions will clear before morning. Confidence that counterparties will still trust each other during stress. Confidence that liquidity will remain available when markets become unstable. Confidence that reserve assets held abroad will still remain accessible during periods of political tension. Confidence that the infrastructure will still function tomorrow the way it did yesterday. And modern finance depends on enormous amounts of invisible confidence layered across enormous distances simultaneously. Banks trusting institutions they will never physically meet. Governments storing reserves inside systems controlled somewhere else. Energy exporters sending fuel across oceans, expecting settlement systems to remain operational by the time the shipment arrives weeks later beneath another coastline. Most of the time, the machinery continues functioning quietly enough that almost nobody notices how much trust is required just to keep ordinary life stable. Until something interrupts the flow. Right now, enormous volumes of transactions are still moving quietly through settlement systems spread across multiple continents. Payment instructions crossing darkened server infrastructure beneath financial districts. Collateral moving between institutions before dawn. Funding desks still active beneath fluorescent office lighting, while entire office towers above them slowly go dark, one floor at a time. Above ground, most of the city already looks asleep. But deeper inside the infrastructure, the machinery underneath settlement continues operating continuously through the night. London slows down. Singapore is already awake. New York funding desks are still reviewing overnight liquidity exposure, while rain moves against dark glass somewhere outside the building. Currency markets continue shifting quietly between time zones before sunrise. The system hands liquidity, collateral, and risk across continents, continuously through the night. Most people never see this layer directly. But enormous parts of the global economy depend on it every hour of every night. Take a moment and imagine how strange the modern world would feel if all of that invisible trust suddenly weakened for even a few days. Ships would still physically exist. Ports would still physically exist. Factories would still stand exactly where they stood yesterday. Oil would still move through pipelines and across dark oceans. But uncertainty would begin spreading through the financial layer underneath movement almost immediately. Banks would hesitate before extending short-term funding. Counterparties would begin recalculating exposure. Liquidity would tighten quietly across multiple markets at the same time. And systems that normally feel almost frictionless could suddenly start feeling extremely fragile very quickly. For decades, many governments assumed the dominant settlement architecture would remain politically neutral enough that most participants could continue depending on it indefinitely. And for a long time, the system mostly functioned that way. Globalization expanded. Capital moved freely across larger distances. Reserve assets accumulated inside familiar systems. Trade deepened through the same settlement corridors, year after year. Eventually, the infrastructure underneath global finance started feeling almost invisible. But systems connected to power rarely remain completely neutral forever. Especially once geopolitical tension begins entering the infrastructure directly. A sanctions package expands farther than expected. Reserve assets become restricted. Cross-border payment access becomes politically sensitive during conflict. Settlement infrastructure, once treated almost like invisible plumbing, suddenly starts feeling connected to strategic leverage more directly than many countries previously assumed possible. That shift changes behavior gradually at first, quietly enough that most people outside the system barely notice it happening. Central banks begin diversifying reserve composition. Governments expand bilateral settlement agreements. Alternative payment systems begin forming beside older ones. Regional clearing infrastructure grows slowly beneath the surface of traditional dollar settlement networks. Trade partners experiment with settling contracts in local currencies instead of routing every transaction through the same corridors. Gold begins returning quietly to conversations around reserves, collateral, and settlement confidence. Not because the dominant system suddenly disappears. The transactions are still clearing tonight. From the surface, most of the machinery still looks stable. But dependence feels different once vulnerability becomes visible enough. Right now, reserve managers are probably still reviewing exposure beneath fluorescent office lighting, inside buildings most people will never enter. Coffee cooling beside half-open reserve reports. Cross-border liquidity projections updating quietly across darkened terminals. Satellite maps glowing softly against conference room walls. Spreadsheets stretched across long tables while cleaning crews move silently through empty financial towers, somewhere farther down the hallway. Most people inside those rooms are not trying to overthrow the global financial system. They are trying to reduce uncertainty before the next disruption arrives. One reserve adjustment. One liquidity agreement. One backup system at a time. The interesting thing about trust is that it behaves a little like physical infrastructure. It takes years to build, sometimes decades. And once enough systems depend on it simultaneously, people stop noticing it almost entirely. Until confidence weakens. Then suddenly, everybody notices the infrastructure underneath the system at the same time. That is part of what makes settlement transitions difficult to recognize while they are happening. From the surface, everything still appears stable. Markets still open every morning. Cargo still arrives. Fuel still moves. Office towers still glow through the rain after midnight. Most of the visible machinery continues functioning normally, but underneath it, participants slowly begin building alternatives they hope they never fully need to depend on. Imagine standing inside a half-empty financial tower, very late at night. Rows of abandoned desks beneath dim overhead lighting. Cleaning carts rolling quietly across polished floors. Server rooms humming deeper inside the building behind secured doors. A few remaining office lights still glowing above settlement exposure models while rain presses softly against the glass outside. The visible world above ground still feels calm. Traffic still moves. Ships are still crossing oceans. The terminals are still glowing. But inside the infrastructure underneath global finance, people have already started thinking differently about trust. Not collapse, not panic. Just enough uncertainty entering the system that governments begin preparing for outcomes they once considered unlikely. And once enough participants begin preparing for alternative outcomes, the architecture underneath settlement slowly begins changing with them. The infrastructure still functions tonight. Liquidity still moves across continents before sunrise. But inside the system, confidence no longer feels quite as automatic as it once did. And once trust changes, Behavior usually changes quietly behind it. The difficult part of replacing a global settlement system is not trade. It is finality. A country can agree to purchase oil in another currency. A shipping contract can move outside traditional corridors. Bilateral trade can expand between regional partners. Additional payment systems can begin forming beside older infrastructure. But eventually, every large financial system reaches the same question. What asset actually settles the balance at the end? Because movement is one thing, final settlement is something else entirely. A shipment can cross an ocean. An invoice can be issued. A contract can be signed beneath fluorescent office lighting somewhere after midnight. But underneath all of it, another layer still has to function quietly in the background. Liquidity, collateral, trust, finality. For decades, the answer often returned to the same infrastructure. Dollar liquidity, treasury markets, correspondent banking systems, reserve assets trusted deeply enough that enormous amounts of global trade could continue flowing through them continuously without participants needing to renegotiate confidence every morning before markets opened. And after enough years, the architecture underneath settlement itself started feeling almost permanent. Most people rarely think about final settlement directly, because the machinery usually remains invisible during stable periods. Transactions clear, balances update, collateral moves. Funding markets absorb stress before sunrise. The system absorbs enormous amounts of coordination quietly enough that daily life above it continues feeling normal. Coffee shops open. Airports operate. Fuel arrives. Electricity stays on. Most people never notice the trust layer underneath any of it at all. But final settlement depends heavily on confidence. not just confidence in currencies. Confidence in liquidity during stress. And once systems reach global scale, replacing that level of trust becomes extremely difficult. Right now, there are probably financial institutions still balancing cross-border exposure beneath fluorescent office lighting, while rain moves slowly across empty financial districts outside. Liquidity reports updating quietly across darkened terminals. Collateral shifting between counterparties before dawn. Most people inside those offices are not trying to predict the collapse of the global order. They are trying to understand how much fragmentation the existing system can absorb before liquidity itself starts behaving differently. Take a moment and imagine how much hidden coordination is required just to keep one ordinary financial day functioning normally across multiple continents. Most of the visible economy appears simple from the surface, but underneath it sits an enormous architecture of timing, coordination, leverage, and confidence, operating continuously through the dark. The machinery never fully sleeps. That is part of why parallel settlement systems often grow slowly. Because building a payment rail is easier than building trust. And building trust is easier than building deep liquidity capable of surviving periods of global stress. Large settlement systems become powerful, partly because so many participants already depend on them simultaneously. The system feels stable because everybody assumes everybody else will continue using it too. For decades, many countries accepted that arrangement because the dominant infrastructure remained liquid enough, predictable enough, and politically stable enough that few participants seriously questioned the underlying architecture. And for a long time, the system mostly functioned that way. Global trade expanded. Capital flowed across larger distances. Energy markets deepened through familiar settlement corridors. Reserve assets accumulated inside the same financial structures year after year. Eventually, the infrastructure underneath settlement itself started feeling almost invisible. But systems feel different once access starts feeling less automatic. A sanctions package expands farther than expected. Reserve assets become restricted. Cross-border payment systems begin reflecting geopolitical pressure more directly. And suddenly, countries start thinking differently about the difference between participating in a system and depending entirely on one. That shift changes behavior gradually. Central banks diversify reserve composition. Governments expand bilateral liquidity agreements. Not because the dominant system suddenly disappears. The old infrastructure is still operating tonight. From the surface, most of the machinery still looks stable. But systems feel different once enough participants stop assuming the final layer will always remain neutral. Right now, reserve managers are probably still reviewing exposure beneath half-lit conference rooms, while rain moves across dark financial districts outside. Coffee cooling beside liquidity reports. Cross-border settlement projections updating quietly across terminals. Cleaning crews moving silently through mostly empty office floors, while a few remaining desks continue glowing long after midnight. Most people inside those buildings are not trying to build a new global order. They are trying to reduce vulnerability before the next disruption arrives. One reserve adjustment. One liquidity line. One settlement agreement at a time. The interesting thing about final settlement is that it only becomes visible once confidence weakens. During stable periods, the system simply feels automatic. Transactions clear, balances settle. Markets open again the next morning, exactly the way they did yesterday. But once enough participants begin questioning the neutrality or permanence of the underlying infrastructure, behavior starts changing long before the visible system fully changes with it. The visible world still feels connected. But deeper inside the infrastructure underneath global finance, the conversations already sound different than they did a decade ago. The ships are still moving tonight. markets will still open again in a few hours. Most of the world waking tomorrow morning will never see that layer of the system directly. But inside reserve systems, funding desks, and settlement networks operating through the night, a more difficult question is already beginning to spread. Not how to move trade, but how to settle it once confidence itself becomes fragmented. Most of modern finance rests on collateral most people never think about directly. Government bonds, reserve assets, gold, liquidity facilities, emergency swap lines extending quietly across central banking networks during periods of stress. Most of these systems remain invisible during stable years. Transactions clear, markets open, fuel arrives. Daily life continues normally above the surface. And because the machinery usually keeps functioning, very few people spend much time thinking about the assets sitting quietly underneath the system itself. But underneath global finance sits an enormous reserve layer, holding confidence together during unstable periods. Collateral backing liquidity. Reserve assets supporting currencies. Government debt quietly, supporting enormous layers of financial activity above it. And once enough institutions begin depending on the same reserve structure simultaneously, the system develops extraordinary depth. Deep capital markets, deep liquidity, deep reserve trust. For decades, the dominant settlement architecture benefited enormously from that depth. Not only because the infrastructure was large, but because participants trusted that the underlying collateral layer would continue functioning during stress. That trust matters more than most people realize. Because settlement systems are not sustained only by technology. They are sustained by confidence. That value will still hold. Once markets become unstable enough, that trust itself starts getting tested directly. Right now, reserve assets are still sitting quietly inside custodial systems, sovereign accounts, and central bank reserve structures spread across multiple continents. Gold beneath reinforced concrete and steel. treasury securities resting inside institutional balance sheets, collateral moving quietly between counterparties before dawn. Most people rarely think about where those underlying assets physically sit. Because during stable periods, custody itself becomes almost invisible. Take a moment and imagine how strange the modern financial system would feel if everybody suddenly started questioning access to the reserve layer underneath it at the same time. Not ownership. Access. Those are not always identical things. A country can technically own reserve assets held abroad while still remaining dependent on external infrastructure to fully access, transfer, settle, or mobilize them during periods of tension. And once governments begin thinking carefully about that distinction, reserve management starts feeling very different than it did during more stable decades. Right now, there are probably still central bank officials reviewing reserve allocation beneath fluorescent office lighting, while rain moves slowly across dark financial districts outside. Gold exposure, foreign reserves, settlement access, counterparty risk, liquidity buffers, custodial arrangements. Long conference tables covered in reserve reports, while coffee cools beside half-lit terminals, sometime after midnight. Most people inside those rooms are not preparing for collapse. They are trying to reduce vulnerability before the next period of instability arrives. For decades, many governments treated the dominant reserve infrastructure as politically neutral enough that deep dependence felt manageable. And for a long time, the system mostly functioned that way. Reserve assets accumulated inside familiar structures. Treasury markets deepened. Dollar liquidity expanded across larger portions of the world economy. Global finance became increasingly interconnected through the same collateral foundations. Year after year, eventually, the reserve layer underneath the system started feeling almost permanent. But systems connected to power rarely feel completely neutral forever. Especially once reserve access begins intersecting more directly with geopolitical pressure. Reserve restrictions appear. Sanctions expand. Asset access becomes politically sensitive during conflict. And suddenly, countries begin thinking differently about where collateral sits. Who controls custody infrastructure? And how much reserve exposure should exist outside their direct reach? That shift changes behavior gradually. Central banks increase gold purchases. Reserve diversification expands. Alternative custodial arrangements begin forming beside older systems. Countries begin spreading reserve exposure across a wider range of jurisdictions, assets, and settlement structures than they once considered necessary. Not because the dominant system suddenly disappears. The old infrastructure is still functioning tonight. But reserve systems feel different. Once enough participants stop assuming access will always remain during periods of stress. The interesting thing about collateral is that it behaves almost like trust made physical. Invisible during calm periods. Essential once instability arrives. And once confidence weakens deeply enough. Governments begin caring much more about where the underlying reserve layer actually exists physically. Not just financially, physically. Imagine standing inside a deep underground vault very late at night. Reinforced concrete disappearing into darkness beyond the edge of the light. Metal doors sealed beneath layers of security. Climate systems humming quietly through the structure. Rows of reserve assets sitting silently behind barriers most citizens will never see directly. The visible financial world above ground still appears fluid, digital, instant. But underneath that world, trust still depends heavily on physical systems resting quietly in the dark. Meanwhile, transactions continue moving across global networks, above those reserve layers, continuously through the night. Currency markets still shift before sunrise. Funding desks still review liquidity exposure. Settlement systems still process enormous volumes of obligations before morning. The visible machinery of globalization continues functioning. But underneath it, more governments seem increasingly interested in understanding exactly where the final layer of collateral actually sits once conditions become less predictable than they once appeared. The rain outside sounds heavier now. Beyond the financial districts, the visible world still looks mostly stable tonight. Markets will still open again in a few hours. Ships are still crossing oceans. But inside reserve systems, vault networks, and custodial infrastructure operating quietly through the night. The assumptions underneath global finance no longer feel quite as permanent as they once did. For a long time, much of the modern financial world operated as though the underlying architecture would remain stable indefinitely. The settlement systems, the reserve structures beneath them, the custody networks most people never think about directly. The trust holding all of it together quietly through the night. And for decades, the machinery functioned efficiently enough that many countries accepted deep dependence as simply part of globalization itself. Trade expanded, liquidity deepened, capital moved across larger distances. Reserve assets accumulated inside familiar systems, year after year. And after enough time, the infrastructure underneath global finance stopped feeling temporary. It started feeling permanent. But systems connected to power rarely feel completely neutral forever. Especially once geopolitical tension begins entering the infrastructure directly. Reserve access becomes politically sensitive. Settlement corridors begin reflecting strategic pressure more openly. And once enough participants begin questioning long-term neutrality, behavior starts changing quietly across the system. Not suddenly, gradually. Transactions are still clearing quietly across enormous financial networks tonight while most cities sleep. Reserve balances still shift between institutions before dawn. Collateral still moves through systems most people will never see directly. Currency markets continue passing liquidity and risk across time zones through the night. The visible world still appears remarkably connected. Yet more governments now seem increasingly interested in systems capable of functioning under less predictable conditions than the world once assumed possible. Take a moment and imagine how much of modern civilization ultimately depends on shared belief. Belief that contracts will settle normally during stress. Belief that reserves will remain accessible. Belief that liquidity will still exist tomorrow morning if markets suddenly become unstable overnight. Large financial systems continue functioning because participants trust the underlying ledger deeply enough to keep extending credit, liquidity, and risk through it continuously. But trust changes slowly, once enough participants begin questioning permanence. Reserve diversification expands. Settlement experimentation increases. Gold flows differently. Trade agreements evolve. Additional liquidity arrangements begin forming beside older structures. Backup systems slowly become part of long-term strategic planning instead of temporary contingency preparation. Not necessarily replacing the old architecture, but preparing for a world that feels less singular than it once did. Right now, there are probably still policymakers, reserve managers, and central banking officials sitting beneath fluorescent office lighting, reviewing long-term exposure models, while rain moves quietly across dark financial districts outside. Coffee cooling beside reserve reports. Half-lit conference rooms still active long after midnight. Security lights glowing across mostly empty office floors while cleaning crews move silently through the building. Most people inside those rooms are not trying to dismantle the global system. They are trying to understand how much dependence feels safe in a world that no longer feels quite as predictable as it once did. For decades, the dominant assumption was that deeper integration would continue indefinitely. More interdependence, more centralized liquidity, more shared infrastructure connecting larger portions of the global economy through the same financial architecture. And for a long time, the system mostly moved in that direction. Now the conversation sounds slightly different. Exposure, redundancy, resilience, strategic autonomy, access, custody, settlement flexibility during periods of stress. The language itself has started changing quietly inside the system. Somewhere beyond the harbor tonight, ships are still crossing black water beneath blinking navigation lights. Container terminals still glow before dawn. Financial servers continue processing transactions through the rain. Most of the visible world still looks remarkably stable tonight. But deeper inside the infrastructure, underneath global finance, the assumptions no longer sound quite as permanent as they once did. The old system is still there, vast, deeply embedded into the structure of the modern world. But more governments now seem less interested in trusting a single ledger entirely. And once enough countries begin building parallel forms of settlement, reserve storage, and financial access, the architecture underneath globalization slowly stops feeling singular. Not all at once. Quietly, enough that many people may not fully recognize the transition until much later. The world outside your window probably still feels almost identical to yesterday. Traffic moving through wet streets. Office towers still glowing above financial districts late into the night. Cargo still arriving through harbor fog somewhere beyond the coastline. And deep inside the infrastructure underneath global trade, settlement systems continue moving. Liquidity, collateral, and risk, quietly through the dark. For decades, much of the world relied on a relatively concentrated financial architecture for final settlement. And for a long time, the system functioned efficiently enough that most participants stopped thinking very much about the infrastructure underneath it at all. Transactions cleared. Reserve assets remained accessible. Liquidity continued moving across borders, through familiar corridors, year after year. Eventually, the architecture underneath settlement itself started feeling almost permanent. Now the conversation sounds slightly different. Not collapse. Not sudden replacement. Just uncertainty entering systems, once treated almost like neutral infrastructure. Questions about access. Questions about reserve exposure. Questions about custody. Questions about who still controls the ledger once geopolitical tension enters the settlement layer directly. Right now, reserve managers are still reviewing exposure beneath fluorescent office lighting before dawn. Collateral continues moving quietly between institutions. Gold still rests beneath reinforced concrete and steel. Servers continue processing transactions while rain presses softly against dark financial district windows outside. Most people will never directly see these systems operating. But civilizations often begin changing behavior long before the visible structure above them fully changes shape. The world still appears deeply connected tonight. Global trade continues moving. Financial markets will still open again in a few hours. Most of the system still appears stable tonight. But underneath the confidence that shaped globalization for decades, the assumptions supporting the system no longer feel quite as automatic as they once did. Because in the end, global finance is not only about ownership, it is also about custody, access, liquidity during stress, and who continues controlling the final layer of trust once the world becomes less certain than it used to seem. Because eventually, every financial system leads back to the same question. Not only who owns the reserves, but where they are held once access becomes uncertain. Beyond the rain tonight, the infrastructure underneath the modern world continues operating quietly through the dark. The archive remains open. Good night.